how do I assess digital assignments?
Yeah, so that's a great question.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of thinking and a lot of work about assessment of digital texts in the classroom.
Someone once said this to me, and I've used it now multiple times, that assessing digital text is a beast.
Assessment has always been one of my stickier issues.
The questions about assessment in digital rhetorics are perilous.
And I think that just stems from we have a lot of anxiety around assessing kind of standard alphabetic texts. And so then you're throwing in additional modes of communication. And it's not just that there's more modes, it's that these modes collaborate, that they mix. So that complicates it.
I think that often what drives digital rhetoric assignments is sort of novelty and defamiliarization. And those are exactly the things that sort of mitigate against having reliable ways to assess that work.
And then that complication is exacerbated by the fact that I think when you assign digital projects, you get a real diversity in terms of what ends up getting turned in.
Because I think it's highly problematic to design a really good assignment that has one set of assessment criteria. If you tell students exactly what to do in an assignment and they do it exactly the way you want, the assessment's already built in. I mean, you've done it or you haven't done it, right?
So how is a podcast comparable to a video, which is comparable to a Prezi, which is comparable to a blog post? Like, how can you actually assess these things in ways that are commensurate?
So when I assess digital rhetoric, I do what I think many people do, which is have the students create the product, go through the process to make this text, or to engage in digital rhetoric in some manner, and then also have the reflective piece.
Asking them to reflect upon that kinds of the work that they did.
Why did you try to do what you did? What were your kind of working assumptions about the audience? Just kind of talking through those issues a lot.
And then really just, saying, okay, hey, you got an A on it. Because it's not really so much about the grade, it's about what they learned through that process.
For me, I'm much more interested in students being able to talk about the process and develop some self-consciousness about the choices that they made than I am in evaluating a finished form per se.
So it's not that their product doesn't matter, but often in the product isn't where the learning is evident. It's not where it resides.
But mostly I guess kind of look at ability to narrate and think critically about the process of invention, self-consciousness about the medium in relationship to the audience and maybe why they made those choices in relationship to an audience.
So that what you're assessing is not just the product, and I've heard of some folks not even assessing the product, but assessing the student's understanding of the process of creating that, and the fittingness of the product that they created.
And you don't actually grade the digital project itself, you grade the reflection. And that's useful, especially if it's an early assignment in the semester and you're not teaching the skills necessary to do the digital project. You just want students to take a risk and try. So I think that's one way of doing assessment, is to grade the reflection.
So the way that I've resolved the issue of how do you grade digital products is removing the grading from the product itself and essentially onto the work that they do. So they're basically, at the end, they essentially make a case for, here's the work that I did, and that's what gets graded. I'm not actually grading the product, I'm grading your weekly reflections, which is, I think, a really good way of handling digital rhetoric, which tends, I think, to be more diverse in terms of the range of projects you get. And I think generally just good writing pedagogy where you separate grading from feedback on writing. You build in a kind of safety net by grading the process as opposed to the product.
Sometimes reflections can be not the most authentic genre, but I feel like doing lots of different kinds of reflections, if they're talking to a classmate in class, or they're writing, and then they're writing a more formal reflection essay along with the digital product, sort of I can look at all of those things and sort of triangulate my assessment approach.
I love the justification statement. I love having students explain why they did what they did. And it doesn't need to be super formal. Sometimes it takes a shape of a presentation. You know, you're going to present your informational campaign, and in part of that presentation, you need to tell me, why did you make that logo? Why did you choose those colors? Why in that video did you choose that sound clip? What were your choices and why did you make them? And their ability to articulate that for me really indicates a discursive consciousness, which indicates learning to me in my courses, and I make that clear to them.
And I think it's incumbent upon if I'm teaching, it's incumbent upon the student to be able to explain the success or non-success, where the issues were with the production. So I think the assessment lies primarily in the rhetorician and the rhetor, the maker of the rhetorical objects. I want them to tell me how I should assess this, because it means they have an understanding of what they've done in a way that really is more kind of critically engaged than if I give them a rubric or if I ask them, to just write a reflection.
I'm not a rubricer, but when a rubric is used as a pedagogical tool to sort of think about either mode or resource, I think that's important.
You can start developing rubrics with class about why they made the choices they did, how they're rhetorical, how the technology enables in various ways, and if it enables, what's the best way to pursue it through that technological platform or medium.
And when it comes to things like practical things like making a rubric, I have a rubric that has 4 general areas. So it's conceptual, rhetorical, stylistic, and technical. And I tell students, though, that I'm going to evaluate them holistically. So in that case, a student who has a really interesting concept but is only able to execute, say, a paper prototype, that student can still get a good grade. Because I think it's really important not to be too enamored with a particular kind of polished artifact.
I think because I come from a media department, I am constantly evaluating creative work all the time. And so there's obviously the conceptual and technical criteria, technical, did you accomplish whatever technical goals I set out for you? And conceptual, are you getting the assignment? Are you understanding it? Are you articulating it? But I also think storytelling is probably where you have to sit. I think with the criteria of digital, did they accomplish not just what the assignment was, but they were able to articulate a story, and there's lots of criteria matrix you can use for that. But, so for me, it's less sticky.
What I try to do is, as a class, we come together and we say, here's the project prompt, and admittedly it's a very loose and vague prompt that kind of gives them these wide parameters and contours within which to work. And so given this, and given the kind of content we've been discussing in class and you've been reading outside of class, what seem like appropriate criteria that are also loose enough, that are capacious enough, that they will be applicable to the range and breadth of text that they're going to produce.
I go about assessing digital rhetoric essentially the same way I go about assessing any other work.
If the goal is to make stuff, right? So if we're making a digital text or digital practice or digital performance, I think the assessment has to come through the kind of rhetorical analysis of that particular thing, object, performance, whatever that has been created. So you go back to the mechanisms that we would use to analyze, flip back onto what we've used to produce, right? And so then you have to see where those map out.
A lot of the assignments I typically give are fairly open-ended. And then in terms of assessment, what I do is I have students spend the time on their own to identify, what makes a good kind of this thing I want to make. So they do the research to identify the various genres they're participating in, the communities they're looking at, and then thinking about what qualifies as a good work.
So that's what I do. I bring up skills, bring up rhetorical strategies, go over them and analyze, and then I hold them accountable for those things. So it's not like all of a sudden you have to be a filmmaker, but I want them to be able to pick apart a video too, and how was that produced? Even the simple placement of text, how long does it stay up on the screen? Was that effective?
And so it's often very rhetorically conscious. So what's your rhetorical situation? How do you attend to audience? So what's your audience awareness? What sort of style do you use? The arrangement. And of course, you can think about style in multiple ways, arrangement in multiple ways. So in some ways, it's kind of rooted in the canons, but thinking of those canons not in the sort of linear, prescriptive, classical sense, but in kind of maybe more of how Colin Brooke thinks about it, or how Yancey asks us to think about it in her chair address, of thinking about them in dialogue, or what you get when you pair them rather than thinking about them in isolation.
My own sense is that digital rhetoric is sufficiently new that it behooves us all to use every single one of these opportunities as an opportunity to learn.
First of all, I invite them to kind of self-assess, and I ask each of them to sort of kind of take stock of where they're at, and then take stock again at the end and sort of demonstrate to me that they've pushed their abilities. That's hard to assess by myself. And so assessment becomes less me and more we.
So what did you learn? What did we learn? What have we all learned that can contribute to this larger enterprise? So that's a through line crossing all of them. I expect all of us to learn and all of us to contribute.